In this video, I'm going to show you how I created this foot here, how I weathered it. It's two colors, which is nice. It shows how I handled the two different colors. And this is the base foot here, so it's already been deckled. So a little bit of a preface of what I've done here is that it's been primed in gray primer. It was then painted with water-based acrylics for both the blue and the white. The blue is a mixture of scale 75 paints. The off-white here is Vallejo Mecha Colors off-white. They were then deckled, so that the decals will be underneath the weathering, and then they were actually done coated with matte clear coat from Vallejo. So the Vallejo Mecha matte clear coat was then applied to all of it to seal in the decals. But also it's going to work better for the weathering that I'm going to do on it. So often you do a lot of the weathering stuff onto a gloss coat, and panel lining onto a gloss coat, but I'm finding that with the weathering pencils that I'm going to be using, that they work way better on a matte coat. So we're going to use that. The colors that I'm using are olive green, dark gray, dark blue, and green blue. So obviously the gray is pretty straightforward because we've got a lot of gray on there. The dark blue is because we've got a lot of blue there, just to shade that. And then the olive green and the green blue are just to add a little bit of color variance to it, to add a little bit more variety to the tones on it, and make it a little bit more visually interesting. I wanted to make sure I stayed away from reddish tones because I don't want it to look rusty, because it's a space-based suit. So it's just going to have some discoloration. And then on top of that, I'm using a bit of white paint on the edges, and a little bit of a mix of white and blue on the edges as well, which is going to be these two. Just in some spots, just to show a bit more wear and to really highlight. You can kind of see that here. There's little bits of white on here, and then really light blue on the blue parts, just to make the edges pop a little bit better. So what's kind of unique with this is, although I'm using the weathering pencils, technically I'm not really using the weathering pencils. So what I'm doing with them is I'm using them as a watercolor paint, basically. So what I kind of want AK to do is just release them in like a tin, because all I'm doing here is I'm wetting them and then I'm making a pool. So I'm using an old business card here. It needs to be something that'll grip to, and I'm soaking the pencil just to get it wet, and then I'm just sort of rolling it to get some of that color onto the card. Okay. And I'm going to use a really small brush. I'm using a synthetic brush here, just because it's got a very fine tip to it. And the synthetic brush is going to work just fine. If I were doing a lot of painting, I use natural brushes, but for this stuff, the synthetic is going to work great. So the first thing I do is I take some of this and I take it really sort of thick, and I do some of the edges here just sort of randomly. And if it doesn't go on perfectly, that's fine, because what's so nice about the weathering pencils is that you can erase them until you've sealed them on. Like, I can come back days later and add water and they'll reanimate. It also means, though, that you have to be really careful handling it until you've finished the painting. So there we go, a little bit of a mistake because I looked away for a second. But I can just wet it and then it's going to come right off. There we go. So I'm taking this dark blue, or sorry, this dark gray. I'm using it just to create some sort of a chipping effect here. You don't need to be tidy at all. The main thing is that I'm keeping it close to the edges. I'm not doing everywhere. And most of the time, if you make a little mistake, you can just work with it. Where there's edges going off in more than one direction, then I sort of go off in more directions with it. There we go. Just like so. So here we go. And adding in the odd little sort of stretch bringing into it. just sort of adds to it, and we can add little bits. You know, a little dot here and there. I want this to be fairly thick, because I want to have strong color. I just want to pull out the edges here. And the order that you do these layers doesn't matter too much. I'm probably going to come back and add a little bit more here. I am keeping in mind though that the white or the light blue highlights are going to go in between the dark gray spots. So there does need to be gaps between for that to go. Yeah, it's pretty straightforward here. The exact same for the off-white. I'm using the exact same color here. And the trick here is to not go too heavy, everything in moderation. It's always easy to over-weather things. And that's fine. So I'm just kind of work on it panel by panel. There we go. And because these are feet, I don't mind going a little bit heavier on the weathering and the chipping, because feet tend to get a little bit more damaged. Just because they're interacting with more surfaces or ground or whatever else, landing on different surfaces. And what's nice is with these is you can make it really subtle and turn it into a filter. So basically I'm using these watercoloring pencils in multiple ways here. So I'm using them like a paint to do chipping. I'm watering them down to add color variation like a filter. And then what I'm also doing is I'm using them panel line. So for that, I'm using the dark blue. There aren't any really panel lines on the gray on this piece, but dark blue I can use. So the exact same thing, I make it wet. Just make a little pool of it here. Just kind of roll it out and just get some nice color down. And so we got a little part here. Trying to get some color there. You can let it dry, although this does reanimate, you can layer it if it's dry. You just kind of apply it quickly. You can see it's a little bit messy here. I'm not worried about that because, like I said, we can always just erase it. So that's nice. We can use it here as like a filter, just to add a different tone of blue here. And these little bits. There we go. If you water it down a lot, it'll run along a bit like your normal weathering or your normal panel line fluid, but I find you kind of have to brush it in for the most part. But again, you don't have to be super tidy because you can always erase it. Here, I don't mind it being darker because it's going to be in shadow. Anywhere here that's a little bit messy, I'm just going to sort of erase it and blend it back in. Like so. So we get rid of that hard edge. I want it softer, I don't mind having a bit of it there because it's still in shadow. Got a little bit extra here, that's fine. I'm just going to erase that. So like enamel washes, you can do this too. You can erase it with the enamel, but you can't do it quite as easily as you can with just water here. And the enamel wash will only work up to maybe 24 hours, and even then it gets pretty hard. Whereas this stuff, it'll like I said, you can come back to this a week later and it's going to reanimate it just fine. Until you top coat it with another clear coat. Just got to make sure you don't touch it with sweaty hands. So I'm being really careful here to just hold it by the top part, because if I touch any of it, I may reanimate it and cover it in fingerprints. Nice thing is they wouldn't be permanent, like if they were an enamel, I could erase them again, but I'd have to redo everything. So there we go, we got a bunch of chipping down here. I'm going to add a bit more onto this piece now. Not going to do the entire foot on this video because, you know, both sides are going to be similar. There we go. Oops. Not an issue. The only thing you do also have to make sure is that the surface you're working on is dry. So if I were to try and apply something onto here where I just wet it, it's just going to sort of spread out across the whole surface, which is fine if I want to use it like a filter. And we'll get to a bit of that in a bit. But right now, because I'm trying to get solid color, I need to be going onto a pretty dry surface for it to get the best results. And like I said, you can layer it too. If it doesn't get dark enough the first go, once it's dry, you can kind of go at it quickly and, you know, add another layer to it and darken it all up. Part of the reason I decided to video this is because I often I'm making stuff up as I go along, so I don't always video it. Actually, I very rarely video it, and I haven't contributed to this channel in a while because I had a lot more time during lockdowns and COVID to, you know, video things and that. But this piece here, after I've done the first foot and I kind of know my approach, I thought it was kind of cool. Figured I'd video it for people to learn, because I think there's possibly a lack of content on how to use the weathering pencils. And I think this is kind of a different way to use them, because I'm not really drawing on at all with them. I'm applying it exclusively with a brush. So the question you might ask here and then is, why am I not just using a watercolor paint? Well, I've tried it. Watercolor paints don't stick as well. And you can use a gouache, which has a more solid color. It's also can be a watercolor, although there are acrylic gouaches. But the gouache acrylic, it doesn't stick as well. I don't mean that it's just going to rub off. It can bead a little bit on the surface. So I find this it works a bit better, a bit more predictably. And it's got a lot of good colors for this application, although that's not a huge issue. I could just mix colors I needed out of an acrylic or out of the watercolor gouache. But yeah, I find this works quite well. And although I've tried using a gouache, I didn't find it worked quite as well. I guess it's because of whatever they mix in. They mix in sort of like a wax, apparently, I think, to help it stick. So I think that's part of it. So even just chipping this, brings it to life quite a lot, I think, but it's just not quite finished enough. So it looks good, looks fine with just chipping, and you could end it with this, and I've done it. But you'll see once we start adding a little bit more tones to add a little bit more depth and shadow to it, it really starts to pop and bring things to life. Trying to get this build done before the new year. I started this kit a long time ago. This was actually the oldest kit in my backlog, and I was determined to get it done. and then several other projects got in the way for competitions, and it didn't get done. So now I'm returning to it, and it's going to be my last thing to finish in 2022. That's the goal. I'm on track, although originally this was going to be a clean build, and that would have been significantly faster to get done, and now we're doing a weathered build, which takes a lot longer because, as you can see, we're going in by hand and painting huge sections of it, which just eats up a lot more time. But I'm happy with it. Turning out pretty well so far. The directions I'm going here are mostly forward to back, just because it's the way feet move. You can see here I don't really have a lot of strength to the color. So I'm going to go over it again once it's dried here, and just add a bit more. There we go. And like I said, you could do this last. I'm doing it first just because it helps me to visualize things a bit better. Doing all the chipping here first. There's a part where I obviously touched it. That's okay, I can go back over that. That is the challenge. I've done this with the acrylic paints too, and this part I could use acrylic paints for and it would work just fine. I can't fix mistakes, that's all. Or if I do, I have to do it very quickly before the acrylic paint dries, because then it's on there permanently. Alright, so we've got lots of chipping in here. I'm just going to add a tiny bit more just in the middle of this piece. Like so. There. There we go. So I'm pretty happy with that now. The other side I'm not really worrying about yet. Okay, so now we're going to start adding in some more color. So I've got my olive green here. This is the AK Weathering pencil olive green. Same process here, we're going to wet it. But the way I'm using this is significantly different. So I'm going to use this more like a filter. So filters are used to add like a slight tint to a color. So armor modelers will use it on like a green, so they can paint it in one green, and then they can use filters to alter that green just ever so slightly to get some variation between different panels, for example. So I'm using this. I'm going to water this one down more. So while I used the gray was very heavy pigmented and not as much water, this is going to be super light. I'm going to apply the greeny color more towards the bottom. Down here, super light. It's just going to give us some tones. If it mixes in with the grays that are already on there, that's fine. It's just going to sort of blend it in. I can go back over later. There we go. Doesn't need to be perfect because I'm going to blend it in. I'm going to add just little bits in other spots too. So I'm using it sort of as a shadow, but also just to add some tonal variance here. And like I said before, I didn't want to use a reddish color because I don't want it to look rusty. Whereas the green is kind of more nondescript. It just adds a bit more variety. It works well both on the white and on the blue. Okay, so we got some green down there now. There we go. There we go, focus, perfect. So now I'm gonna just blend it in. So just with that wet brush, we're gonna just blend it in. Just I don't want any tide marks or hard lines. Here it's a little bit too thick, so I'm gonna remove it, some of it entirely. And I can do that just by wetting it, sort of lifting it with the brush, and then just washing it off the brush. There we go. And if I need it a little bit heavier again, I can just add a little bit more. But this is the main secret to this, is the fact that I can just keep reanimating it and I can really play around with it. And that's why I really like these weathering pencils for this specifically. And you may have remembered I had another color as well that I haven't used yet, and that was the green blue. So I'm going to do kind of the same thing with this, or with it, as I did here. A little bit too heavy in spots, so I can always just brush it back, let it dry, take sort of another look at it. And this color just kind of looks like nondescript griminess. We're just trying to alter it, make it look a little bit more used and dirty, while not completely changing the original color. So you can still tell that the blue parts are blue, and you can still tell that the off-white parts are off-white here. And that's what I want. And where it goes, it doesn't matter too much. I'm mostly going sort of into corner sort of areas, and are areas that I want to be a bit darker, because it's going to help create a bit of a shadow. So there we go, they've got the one tone down. Now I'm going to take that blue-green color, and same thing, we just wet it, and roll it out. This is a very grayish color. In fact, I had to double check to make sure it was the right one. But you can see it's slightly more blue than the other color here. That was the gray I was using, so this is clearly more blue. And the blue is nice because we've got blue on here already, so it sort of ties into that. And I'm going to use this mostly in the corners opposite of where the green is, or sometimes right on top of it, or anywhere that I want to be even darker. So, you know, I want down here to be darker, so I'm going to use it down here. And it can blend it in with the green tones, no problem. Like so. There we go. And again, we're just using this to create more tonal depth and variety, just to break up that white, make it look a little bit more used. I'm going to get some horizontal streaks with it that we're going to blend in, just to add a bit more of that sort of directional weathering. And again, use this color on the blue as well. just add it to the opposite side to where the green is. Just currently at the bottom. Add some here to make it into a shadowed area. And same here. I'm less worried about the underside because the plan with this suit is it's probably just going to be standing. Thought about putting it on a flight stand, but the feet are just kind of weirdly designed here with this blue section sort of sticking in. I don't really like that. So the plan is that it's probably just going to be standing. It's just an out-of-box build as well. It's not, the kit's not customized in any way. So it's coming to life now. Oops, that's not ideal. Not really an issue either. I'm not trying to cover every spot of blue, of the base blue with this either. So having some of the original tone in here is good to have too. And when it dries and I look at it and I get these sort of tide marks, they're called, right here where you can see the edge where it dried, I'm going to go back and I'm going to blend those in just so that we don't have those. So, super easy to get rid of it because they look a little less natural. Sometimes they can be okay, but if they're going to stay there, just make sure they're staying there because you want them there. Not because you made a mistake and left them. So here I'm using it to shade, as like a filter to shade. And just darkening it up here, and I know I had the green there already, but this just sort of mixes in with it and adds just a bit more of an interesting tone. We're going to add in a little bit more green too, into that greeny blue shadow now that we've created. Okay, so I'm pretty happy with how this is coming out. Definitely looks weathered. It's not too overdone, but it's pretty easy if I do feel it's a little bit too heavy. You know, say I don't want this spot here, I can just go and rub it away. There we go, that's pretty much gone now. Alright, now I'm going to just add in a bit more of that dark blue in a few spots just to, you know, re-darken these panel lines now that they've been sort of messed up a bit. I haven't really gone on the back at all, but right in there, and then in this gap here. And I can also use this blue just to add, again, a little bit more tonal variance in a few spots. Because it's quite dark compared to the base blue, I just want to make sure that I don't go too hard with it anywhere. Very small amounts. What I've learned sort of doing this sort of stuff is anytime you can add color that's not sort of black or white, it really adds to depth and really helps to make things pop. And it almost doesn't matter what color you use. So like the green here, you know, you'd think you want to add shadow and stuff. We could do it with more gray, but adding color it adds a bit of warmth to it, and just makes it look better because it gives more hue. without being desaturated, which is what you get if you're only using black and white. It's going to desaturate everything, or neutral grays. And I can use this, my little palette here for days, which I've done before. I'll just come back to it later. Alright, so we've got this side nicely weathered now. I'm going to go in with some white. So what this is actually an artist squash. It's just super heavy bodied and solid color. This is just white. I could just use like another white, but I'm finding this works really well for this application because the color on it is just so solid. It's gonna go over anything I need. And just in very small amounts, I'm gonna take this and use it on the gray. And I'm gonna just pick out some of the edges. And I'm basically like doing little dots. And kind of doing what I did with the gray now in spots that don't have the gray. And sometimes I'll do it under the gray, just to add a little bit of depth to it. And this I do want to do after I've done all the washes, because I want this white to be pretty pure. It's supposed to look like it's just sort of chipped a bit off the surface. I can add a bit of streaking from time to time with it too, but trying to be a lot more moderation with the white than the gray. I'm not trying to get like every spot on the edges here that I didn't get with the gray, so I want to have some of the natural colors still coming through in areas. So it's basically the edges are a mix of white, whatever the natural base color is or the washed color is, and then areas that are the blue, or sorry, the gray, the off-white. And again, sometimes I want to just put a little highlight underneath. And the odd little bit here too, just to add in a bit more variety. Haven't really done this panel at all, so I'm not going to focus on the front anymore. I didn't really fully weather it, so I'll have to go back with it afterwards anyways. And if this mixes in a little bit with the watercolors underneath, that's fine. I don't mind that. Everything can get sort of muddied together because we're using such a nice controlled palette. Anyway, so I've got that. Now with the blue, I tried first of all using just the pure white on the blue, but I found it was a little bit too intense. So finding something a little bit closer is a little bit better. So I had to mix colors for that. So we got this sort of ice blue here, which is a little bit too light still, and then this sort of light blue here. And I found that a mixture of these worked okay. So it was not quite a white color. In fact, I could add a dab of white to that, just lighten it up a little bit more. There we go. So I'm going to do with this color the exact same thing I did with the white, and just go in on some of the edges here. And because it's still so different than the blue is, it makes it look pretty bright. Like it looks almost like white when you put it on the blue, because it's so much lighter. Which is why I found when I did the actual white on it, it was just way too intense. And again, we're not trying to get everywhere, just adding a little bit onto edges here that don't have gray already. The odd corner is nice too. And maybe just add a little bit underneath some sections here. I'm using this sort of to help make some of the ridges in the panel pop a bit better, because with the matte paint they kind of hide some of the bends in the paint, or sorry, in the panel. So this helps to bring them out again, and just it brings out a bit more detailing in the plastic itself, which I like. I don't really use the tip of the brush as much for this. I'm using more like a little bit part way down, like this, in order to only get it on the ridge, the highest point. Gives me pretty good control for that. So. And there we go. So we got another weathered foot here. So pretty similar. I think I used a little bit more green on it on this one, but that's okay. Doesn't need to be exactly the same. And there's what looks like done and not done. And then the front is just sort of partially done. So the front, same idea. Add a little bit to it. I'm going more heavily green towards the part at the bottom here. Like I said, I'm not trying to get like an exact replication of weather based on an environment here. So I'm not, it's not walking in mud or anything, so I'm not trying to make this brown with mud. Just sort of trying to make it look different. It looks weathered even though it's not like a specific type of weathering, or a specific environment's weathering, and that's fine. The fact that I don't have to worry about being super tidy with this means I can go a bit quicker. On this part of the foot though, I like to have a bit more vertical streaking. So it helps convey movement, which is good on feet because they're constantly in motion. And I can add that streaking in with multiple shades and colors and stuff. I'm going to go back in with the gray that I started with. and put in a bit more here, just on this bend in it, which I like to bring out a little bit better. And it got muddied a bit when I put the other colors on top, so that's fine. Just sort of blends all together. I like that. Add a little bit more streaking with that edging gray that I've been using. Especially a bit more right at the bottom here, coming on top of that green. There we go. And then what I'm going to do is take my bluish white here, and go in again. And add some vertical streaks with it as well. And they can be kind of watered down because I want them to be subtle. So having them thinner is great. Almost dry brushing them on. As it just gives it a very light sort of dusting with it. And if it blends in to some of the other colors, all the better. Oops, that's a bit too bright. Back a bit. Alright, so that's the idea on that, although I did go a little bit heavy there compared to the other foot, so I'm actually going to go back and I'm going to erase some of that. So again, this is where these watercolors are so awesome. Not happy with what I did. Go back and erase it. I want to get more of that base blue in there. Now the white tones are not going to erase, but that's okay. There we go. So I'm just bringing that back. Getting it a little bit closer to what the other foot is like. I'm going to erase some of the darker spots on here. Or just lighten them a bit. There we go. That's a bit better. And still a little bit heavy. Again, don't need to be exactly the same, but I don't want one foot to draw your eye in at the expense of the other one. I don't want one to draw all the attention of the viewer. So keeping them kind of similar is important, but they don't have to be the exact same. Okay, that's not bad. There. What I'm going to do is I'm going to actually add a little bit more green onto this one. That's going to help achieve that parity a bit better. Yeah, I like that now. There we go. That's pretty good. So we got our 2 feet. So we got the weathered side. We got the front, which is weathered on one, partially weathered on the other, and then the 2 sides here, weathered and unweathered, just to give you a better look of what those look like. So yeah, hopefully you find that informative. One more thing I'm going to do here is just the metal parts here. I'm going to edge highlight them. This is a graphite pencil, so it's just all graphite. And you can just go on some of the edges to bring them out. And you can see here they catch the light nicely, but when they're not catching the light, they become virtually invisible. And they just kind of look like painted metal that's kind of like a gun metal that the edges have worn a little bit, and exposed the metal. This part here isn't really visible on the finished kit anyways, most of the leg covers it, so I'm not super worried about how tidy it is. But yeah, there we go. Hope you found that somewhat informative. If you did, you liked what you saw, please let me know in the comments. I don't have a ton of time to do these videos. I'm not like a full-time streamer or anything like that. I work a full job. But I'll try and video a bit more of my work this going into 2023 if you found this informative at all. So thanks for giving it a watch, and I'll catch you later.